Hello, everyone. First, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the man, the myth, the legend, Richard Rothstein. Richard is the New York Times best-selling author of The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America, which for many of us in real estate has become our unofficial Bible. And what a treat for us that he is joined today by the illustrious community organizer, consultant, and champion of reforming community correction policies, the one, the only, Leah Rothstein. Leah is Richard's pride and joy, I like to say, his daughter, who co-authored with him the follow-up book to The Color of Law, which is out now, entitled Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. Learn more about this book at justactionbook.org, as well as in our upcoming discussion. Thank you, Richard and Leah, for your time today.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we have a few questions that we're going to cover that I know are itching minds in real estate. We want to know. And honestly, I actually just mentioned before we started that I was at a fair housing conference just yesterday, and some of the questions and feedback we got are related to these questions that I think realtors have, but we don't necessarily want to ask because, there can feel like this stigma of, should I already know this? Should I even have these feelings about this? So let's begin with a quote from The Color of Law, your first book on this subject. And this, I feel like we've got maybe a trilogy. I'm speaking the third book out, but no pressure. So let's begin with a quote from The Color of Law. On page 198, it states, "Only if we could develop a broadly shared understanding of our common history will it be practical to consider steps we could take to fulfill our obligations." So this shared understanding of a common history. I like to sum this up as knowing our history is like taking the 101 class. It's the introductory phase, right? So it's really the introductory phase of being a well-informed real estate professional and practitioner. 101 classes are a good start, but they're never the end all be all. We're not ready for graduation yet. So I feel like we have now a great opportunity to go to this 201 class. And some of the things that we have people coming out of these classes saying, hey, The Color of Law, this book was excellent. Understanding unfair housing history in this course we took today, excellent. But what do I do next? Where do I go from here? That's usually the follow-up, and rightfully so. I think it's a good thing. So tell us more. What should we be focusing just action in as real estate professionals specifically? And how does the book speak to realtors?
Well, let me begin by saying what the previous book, The Color of Law, demonstrated is that realtors cooperated in an unconstitutional and unlawful system of creating segregation. In fact, realtors were one of the primary participants in this. When the federal government required segregation, it was realtors who carried out that policy and prodded the government to go even further in doing so. So realtors have a lot to make up for. There are many things that can be done. I'll give you one example of something that the real estate industry did. After, in 1948, the Supreme Court prohibited courts from evicting African Americans from homes that they purchased in violation of a restrictive covenant, the real estate industry tried to get a constitutional amendment adopted that would permit explicit racial exclusion from communities where the real estate industry was selling property. So how does the real estate industry help to compensate today and undo the harm, the crimes really, that they participated in committing? Well, one thing is, and a very simple thing, and a very minor part of it actually, is eliminating ongoing discrimination. I'm sure that your listeners all are familiar with the Long Island Newsday study of 2019 that demonstrated that in about 50% of the cases where African Americans seek housing, they get discriminatory information from the real estate agents that they visit. And this was a study in Long Island, New York. There's no reason to think that Long Island, New York is any worse than anywhere else in the country. The only way really to root this out is to start enforcing the Fair Housing Act, seriously enforcing it. One way of doing that is by supporting fair housing centers in cities where you operate to conduct paired testing of the kind that Long Island Newsday did, to identify where discrimination occurs, and then not just saying that the realtors should have further education about fair housing, but actually taking action against realtors who discriminate, who steer Black families to Black neighborhoods and white families to white neighborhoods. Fair housing centers in every community in the country have limited financial resources to conduct this testing. And one thing that the real estate industry could do is help them do this, make contributions to fair housing centers to conduct this testing, because nobody has more of an interest in eliminating discrimination in the real estate industry than the real estate industry itself. It needs to clean up its own act, and it needs to cooperate in fair housing centers' efforts to do this. The real estate industry also has big financial obligations to compensate for the harm it did. And this means not only providing down payment assistance, but sometimes even subsidies to African Americans who want to move to neighborhoods that from which the real estate industry once excluded them. The law firms typically have pro bono programs where litigants who don't have the resources to support their own necessary legal representation get free representation from law firms. Why don't real estate boards have pro bono programs that provide, for example, assistance to home buyers who are African American without commission? That would be one thing that could be done. So there are many things that the real estate industry can do. This is just a small part of it, but these things would be a start.
One thing that we have seen in this political climate, unfortunately, is that there is a growing sense of fatigue on doing this type of just action, as you're sharing. One thing I do want to note that's important, and again, this is some of the, I won't call it pushback, but this is just some of the feedback we've been getting, is that the 2022 NAR Realtor Demographics Report shows that the typical realtor is 56 years old. And we know that this is the 55th year of federal fair housing. So in short, the typical realtor, age 56, and those younger like myself, Gen Y, Z, and even Alpha, we weren't alive, right? And we're clearly not responsible for the creation of last century's policies that spread unfair housing. However, of course, every living real estate professional, we have an opportunity to uphold and further housing access and opportunity. I'm a runner, and as a runner, I like to think of this like a relay race where the baton to further fair housing is being passed to us. Yes, we should look back and examine the ground that we've covered, the strides that we've made, such as the fact that in my lifetime, in those of us that weren't here while these policies were created, we have seen, for example, fair housing extended to domestic violence victims. Just in the last couple of years, fair housing now includes gender identity and expression. So we've come a long way. But it really is the time where we can take the baton in this leg of the race. I'm really holding on to this relay example. But how can we take just action to prepare the next generation of realtors? So I am a millennial, but really Gen Z, Alpha, Generation Alpha, who really, as they get older, will say, unfair housing, you're talking about from the 1900s? That's ancient history. That's irrelevant. Why are we even still talking about that?
I'm closer to your generation. And I think it's more than just that we of younger generations have an opportunity to do something about it, but that we have an obligation to do something. And that is because the policies may have been passed and, implemented before we were born, but their impacts survive. Their impacts are still felt today. Our neighborhoods are as segregated as they were previously. The wealth gap is as big as it's always been. The home ownership gap is as big as it was in 1968. So a lot of the impacts and long-lasting effects of those past policies are still very much with us. And the obligation to do something to remedy those falls on us, because here we are. And I'll say from my vantage point, so I grew up obviously with Richard as my father and hearing about the civil rights movement. And I grew up, as a child thinking that as a movement like the civil rights movement just happens. I heard the stories of the victories. I heard the stories of the big actions, the large marches. I didn't necessarily hear all of the stories of all of the hard work it took to get there. And so I think that as we educate ourselves about the victories of past mass movements, we also need to understand that a lot of hard work and a lot of time goes into making gains in these types of issues. And so we can't expect to sort of fix everything overnight. And we have to be careful not to be too impatient, because it's going to take slow, hard work to undo these decades of unconstitutional policies that got us where we are today. So we can learn from the previous generations that we just have to keep moving forward and keep persevering in the face of all of the obstacles up against us. But it's our obligation to do it. It's our responsibility to take this on. And so we have to just keep working at it.
Well said, Leah. Well, I, for the sake of time, don't want to keep you both, but any final thoughts? I'll leave this open to you. Any final thoughts for realtors and taking just action?
Well, I'll add one thing to what Leah just said. I think whether realtors today, 55 or 56 years old, or however old they may be, whether they participated in creating these 20th century policies is irrelevant. All of us as Americans have an obligation to enforce our Constitution and to remedy constitutional violations. And it doesn't matter whether we personally committed them or not, or were even alive when they were committed. I once gave a presentation along with Sherilyn Ifill, then the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And someone afterwards got up and asked that question, said, I wasn't around when this things happened. Why should I be responsible for fixing it? And Sherilyn said one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard. She looked at him and she said, well, you eat hot dogs on the 4th of July, don't you? You weren't around when the Declaration of Independence was signed, yet you accept the privileges of American citizenship. And likewise, you have to accept the obligations of American citizenship, whether you were there when violations were created or not. So I think that's one final thought I might offer you.
Just Action is a book that's full of dozens of policies and strategies that we can undertake and work towards, that are small pieces of the larger puzzle that will together contribute to challenging segregation and redressing the past harms that created segregated communities. And so there's lots of things that we can do in our local communities to take on this issue. And it might feel like an overwhelming issue that, the segregation of our communities feels intractable. It feels like there's nothing we can do. But we hope that Just Action shows that there's actually a lot that can be done locally in our own communities. And we don't lack for options. We just need to get started with any one of them.
Get started. That is wonderful to hear. Let's do it. I'm excited. Thank you both for your time today and for just really handing the baton to us through both of these books. And again, I'm encouraging a trilogy. I don't know if that's too much. Anyway, thank you both. And until next time, again, everyone check out justactionbook.org.